Happy New Year, everyone. It's the first time I've heard that authoritative voice in the calendar year of 2024. We are back. We took a little bit of a break at the end of 2023. Lots of what I biasly am calling great content was created. I hope it was valuable and useful to everyone. And as per usual, what we did well last year, we want to keep doing more of, and what we can do better, we're always trying to attain a higher level of excellence in our execution. So 2024 is going to be a lot more specific to diving into condition-specific scenarios. There's been a lot of requests for those things, and we thought, why not explore some of the big global ones that are affecting people globally, because the statistics are not getting better by and large when it comes to the overall health status of the average person who walks the planet. So exploring concepts, sharing ideas, and gaining deeper understandings. And by no means is this going to be the most comprehensive thing with hypertension, because it's an hour or less, but I'm going to do my best to introduce the idea of really defining what hypertension is, connecting some causative factors to some causative outcomes within the body, and shaping a perspective of hypertension, not from a purely disease model like most people in the medical system do, all roads lead to heart attack, cardiovascular disease, but understanding if you have hypertensive clients, why their vitality is slowly slipping away from them based upon the principal role of what the cardiovascular system is trying to do for the human body. So without fail, let's get into it. What is hypertension? It's pretty self-explanatory. It's elevated blood pressure within the arteries, because the arteries and the veins, although part of the same system, have some differences in both anatomy and function. And when we're talking about high blood pressure, we're talking about this, and it's an invisible force. It's kind of like the wind. You can feel it, you can't see it. But every time your heart pumps, it creates a forced contraction to pump blood out of the chambers into the arteries to be sent systemically around the body. And, on average, it's 72 beats a minute times 60 minutes in an hour times 24 hours in a day. Your heart's doing a lot of work. And under conditions of hypertension, we have an elevation of blood pressure, which causes extra strain and stress to be placed upon the heart and the heart muscles, because it has to work harder to pump the oxygenated and nutrient-rich blood around the body to deliver that to cells. So when it comes to the stats of hypertension, most people, and this is typically something that we start to see in the fourth or fifth decade of life as a manifestation or a diagnosis, most people are dealing with what's called primary hypertension. And this is a slow degradation of the arterial lining based upon internal mechanisms becoming dysregulated. What I mean by dysregulated is the body can't maintain an ideal blood pressure status because of structural changes going on inside of the arteries and the cardiovascular system. There are other lesser known aspects of renal and pituitary adrenal hypertension. Most of those have to do with either water balance or how the body and the brain are regulating the ability to communicate, to controlling what's called the Renin-Angiotensin System, which is the system that most people just gloss over in medical school or when it comes to actually memorizing its function, because it's really complex for a very, very simple purpose. So if you look at statistics as of 2023, hypertension is a 1 in 3 scenario when it comes to affecting adults. That's a lot of people, and hypertension has stages. But fundamentally, we're talking about people who have a blood pressure of at least 140/90 or higher, are taking medications for hypertension, stuff of that nature. And the quantity of people have doubled from 1990 to 2019. And if we factor in statistics from the year 2020 and after, that's probably gone dramatically higher. So if the goal for medicine is to get a handle on the situation, clearly it's not working. And the thing about hypertension that is an additional factor to consider, it's mostly a condition of lifestyle. It's the body's responses to inappropriate external, internal stresses when it comes to its ability to manage how to deliver oxygen and nutrition to various tissues. So when we're talking hypertension, there are different classifications, and they say that if you are a 120 systolic over an 80 diastolic, you are a healthy person. If you are slightly above that, you're not considered hypertensive, but you have slightly elevated normal resting blood pressure. And then there's various stages to the point where you're in a full-fledged hypertensive crisis when your diastolic pressure is what your normal systolic pressure should be. And we'll understand the differences between systolic and diastolic in a minute. But I do want to introduce this idea, not to disagree with the prior chart, because I do agree with it, but blood pressure is not something that is perpetually static within a day. I mean, simply going from a position of sitting to standing increases your blood pressure. When someone cuts you off, in the car on the way to work, that'll increase your blood pressure. Going to the gym, I hope your blood pressure increases, because the last thing I want to see people do is faint on a treadmill from not having enough blood being pressurized up to their brain. And that's the real point of the variations in blood pressure. The body is changing the flow characteristics or the dynamics of the liquid moving in your arteries to ensure that tissues that require blood to be delivered to them, because there's oxygen and there's amino acids and glucose and vitamins and minerals, it's not easy for those tissues to immediately get the absolute amount or quantity of cofactors to supply the energy they need. So the real reason for blood pressure's deviations from norm are to suit the kind of lifestyle that someone lives. And if you look at this chart, based upon this research, which was actually from a Harvard study, when someone was working on home at the computer, they had an ideal blood pressure reading of 120 over slightly below 80. But when they got their blood pressure checked at a doctor's office, it was dramatically higher, because white coat syndrome is really a thing. So I think it's really practical to understand. And if you measure blood pressure at your office, or you do blood pressure measurements with your clients, the likely time you're going to get the worst reading is when they walk in the office, you sit them down in the chair and you take their blood pressure, because they've probably rushed to get over there. They're sitting in the waiting room, potentially anxious about going to the doctor, especially if they're dealing with some kind of health crisis. And if you remember anything about the HPA axis and cortisol and adrenaline, that thing's purpose is to raise your blood pressure and increase blood glucose to deal with stress. So the body has this natural response to the external and internal inputs. So when you measure blood pressure, technically, according to some of the most recent research, the appropriate time to measure blood pressure is 5 minutes after someone has been seated in the same position, allowing them to regulate their breathing and allowing them to fully relax their physiology, or else you're not going to get a true measurement. So someone who is not hypertensive may seem so because of stress, but if you actually control for that variable, if 5 minutes has elapsed and you still get a hypertensive reading, you can judge the validity or verify that that data is probably true data. So what are we measuring when we're actually looking at this systolic, diastolic stuff? It's very simple. The systolic measurement is the higher measurement, which is when the heart is contracting. So it's the force in the arteries or the tubes when blood is being ejected from the heart. And the diastolic number is when the heart's relaxed. And there are scenarios where someone can have regular systolic, but a higher diastolic and whatnot. That might be an indication as to something like a reduced flexibility in the arteries, because you want flexible arteries to be able to properly dilate when there is a need for either relaxation or a need for greater blood pressure to enhance blood flow. It's when there's an increased pressure and a lack of dilation that causes the issue on the right. You have essentially a backing up of pressure in the tube, and the pressure wave that comes out of the heart can reverberate back into the heart. So not only does it cause a little bit of a backflow of blood directly into the heart muscle, it has to cause the muscles in the heart to forcibly contract. And this is where, if someone has had something like this for a while, the musculature in the heart changes. There's hypertrophy in certain chambers in the heart, so the muscle thickens. And not only does it cause a pinching down and an increase of pressure upon each additional contraction, with each beat, the heart pumps less blood volume out, so it has to work harder to do its normal job. And when it comes to hypertension, the thing that I find interesting is there is no hypertension of the veins, only of the arteries. And the arteries have, in some ways, the more important job. I don't want to say one's more important than the other, but without blood going to the arteries, oxygen and nutrition is not properly delivered. Deoxygenated blood is brought back in the veins, and the veins have a different anatomy, but Arteries have a smooth muscular layer, kind of like the digestive system. And over the course of time, if someone is chronically stressed, that smooth muscle layer is in a chronic state of contraction, which pinches down the volume inside the artery. And if you add that on top of changes in the muscular layer based upon injuries, the development of plaque, the potential thickening of the blood, this is why we typically see hypertension issues being primarily arterial in nature, whereas things like clots and thrombotic scenarios can affect both arteries and veins. So in a normal condition, we have a good amount of blood flowing through the tube. And the way I like to explain this to people is if you ever watered your garden, if you turn the hose on full, you're going to have a strong flow through the hose, providing the water coming out of your house is pressurized. What happens if you pinch down that hose? Well, you'll fully cut off the flow of water and you'll increase the pressure in the side of the hose to the point where you might get a bulge. If you release it, the hose goes back to normal and hopefully everything's okay. But if you continuously put that hose under pressure, over time, the rubber or the plastic or whatever the hose is really made of starts to weaken because the increased pressure is causing the material to degrade. The same thing happens inside of the arteries. So if there's a chronic hypertension over the course of months and years, you're placing additional stress on very fragile tissues, because what's interesting about the cells in the arteries, in the gut, they're called the epithelial cells. It's a single cell layer thick, and it's very much a fragile thing. In the arteries, they're called endothelial cells, and they have similar characteristics to where they're easily injured. And the buildup of plaque and cardiovascular disease is actually a natural response of the body to try to deal with the injury that's happening as a result of some of the shear forces or pressures. So if we go back to the hose analogy, on the left-hand side, we see a healthy hose with strong water flow. On the right-hand side, we see what happens if we pinch off the hose. So when we pinch the hose, we're massively increasing the pressure, and that's what's happening in the arteries. But rather than the hose puncturing, the body causes all kinds of physiological changes. You have hypertrophy, the largening of the muscular layer under the arteries. You also lose the elastin properties, so more collagen is deposited and it becomes a lot stiffer, and they become a lot more rigid. So when they do need to dilate naturally, they can't because the structure's changed. And that increased rigidity and lack of flexibility is what compromises the entire integrity of the system and forces structural changes to happen in the heart, which can lead to what's called a myocardial infarction, or a more easy way to say it is a heart attack. And with chronic hypertension, the development of plaque buildup and atherosclerosis, which I practice saying so many times because my Lisdexia makes it very hard to pronounce that word for some reason, but the increased pressure creates a backflow in the artery. And the technical term for that is called a shear stress, because not only is the blood not flowing forwards properly, it's flowing backwards, which also creates a lateral pressure. And the perpetual pressure on the wall, if you look at that arrow in the middle graphic growing thicker, will then damage the walls. And the damage is the initial injury, and the perpetual shear stress is what can cause the damage to perpetuate. And plaque buildup isn't the problem. It's a symptom of a bigger issue. So medically speaking, chronic hypertension typically leads to injury of the arteries and the initiation of plaque formation, which again gets a bad rap because people assume it's simply cholesterol. If you look at the deposition of all the things that come together to make plaque, you'll notice cholesterol crystals are just one of the ingredients. This is kind of like a really necrotic soup, but you see blood clots, you see platelets there, you see lots of lipids. So that can be fats that have been deposited by things like lipoproteins, foam cells and macrophages, which are dead immune cells. You see microvessels formed. You see an increase of the size of the smooth muscle. And then there's always what's called the fibrous cap, which has the collagen and the fibrin. And that's the initiation of the body trying to heal itself, but also prevent this clot from actually breaking and dislodging. So this tissue is very fragile. And there was a period of time within my time teaching in a nutrition school where I had to give this lecture over and over again. And it blew people away to know that cholesterol isn't the principal thing that actually creates plaque formation in the arteries, and it gets a very bad rap. And that's why statins are still probably the single most prescribed pharmaceutical out there to control cholesterol levels. Cholesterol is not a cause of plaque formation. Cholesterol is a symptom of likely arterial inflammation. It is a very waxy and thick substance, so cholesterol is a naturally occurring component of tissue, and the body likely increases its deposition of cholesterol as a result of trying to patch an injury. But when cholesterol gets deposited inside of an injury or a plaque, it oxidizes. And that oxidized cholesterol attracts immune cells. And it's the inflammation from the immune system trying to resolve this issue that really creates the problem and the increased size and deposition of the plaque. And over time, if that injury can't heal, the plaque becomes unstable. And when that plaque becomes unstable, it can tear. The fibrous cap can start to tear off. And now you have a blood clot and a plaque that is circulating systemically around the body. And this is what causes a thrombotic event. If that clot, which has a lot of fibrin and various other components to it, red blood cells, aggregated platelets, if that clot gets lodged in somewhere like a coronary artery, well, that absolutely prevents a lack of blood from flowing through. So the functional changes to the heart muscle are from a cause of lack of blood flow, lack of oxygen delivery, because the heart needs oxygen too. And this necrotic componentry of plaque formation, clot formation that needs to be broken down, but it's grown so quickly that it exceeds the body's ability to break it down, that gets deposited in a very compromised and fragile place. And it's scenarios like this where someone usually undergoes some form of double, triple, quadruple bypass. So the worst case scenario from chronic hypertension is typically this right here: heart attack, cardiovascular disease, and all the associated consequences and damage to the tissue as a result of having arguably the single most fragile organ in the body damaged. And what's interesting is, while a heart attack is still the number one leading cause of death and disease in my memory, or at least I believe so in the Western world, cancer being number two, the heart is the only organ in the body that cannot get cancer. So dealing with the heart is never a cancer consideration. It's always a clot, an attack. It's an energy problem from a lack of blood flow and nutrient delivery. So when we're talking hypertension, the areas of the body that can become affected are quite serious. Anywhere that doesn't get blood flow has a massive downregulation of performance. So that can be something that implicates sexual dysfunction and erectile dysfunction. Kidney disease, because the kidneys have to filter blood, and if they're not getting enough nutrient and oxygen delivery themselves, they become compromised. They dysregulate water balance. Heart stuff we talked about. Vision loss, because there's an absolute need for a correlation between the lack of blood flow above the neck and compromised vision. And if a clot gets into the carotid arteries or the main arteries that go to the brain, you can have a stroke. So we have to understand what controls blood pressure, because that's looking at why blood pressure gets high and the consequences. And it's this very convoluted system called the Renin-Angiotensin System. And it's very complicated to come to this very conclusion. This system is designed to prevent dehydration and to regulate mineral balance in the body. So it's a combination of hormones and enzymes and cofactors produced by the liver, which get activated by the kidneys, which also then get activated by the lungs. And what can influence that is if we are chronically dehydrated and alter kidney function, it will either conserve or release water and try to balance out the sodium and potassium levels. And if someone is dealing with chronic stress, there is this hormone that the adrenals make called aldosterone, which also regulates water balance. And all of these things can very acutely influence blood pressure in a negative way. And what's interesting, if you look at our physiology, functionally, humans were designed to experience lots of physical activity. And before, society became modern, we had a relative lack of resources. We wouldn't get a lot of salt or sodium in a day. We would have access to water if we only found it. Same thing with food. And if you look at hypertensive scenarios, it typically comes from the fourth decade of life because, 200, 500 years ago, we didn't live much past the age of 40 or 50 healthfully. So now we're in a scenario where we have an abundance of resources, we have a very sedentary lifestyle, and our physiology hasn't evolved quick enough to adapt to the changes that our bodies experience. And this is one of the major areas where excessive carbohydrate, excessive salt, excessive polyunsaturated fat consumption, too much sodium, not enough potassium, potentially under consuming high quality water. The body's just trying to regulate blood pressure from a lack of consistency based upon the intake of what it needs. So when hypertension is diagnosed, there's the go-to strategies that the medical process tries to implement. So most pharmaceutical drugs try to cut off the renin-angiotensin systems. Sometimes we use diuretics, so we push water out to try to naturally regulate the excessive amount of water causing pressure in our arteries. We can look at calcium channel blockers, and that typically downregulates the performance of the heart. So yes, you might regulate blood pressure, but you're going to have no energy if you want to do something active. And then there's the general things, limit your salt intake with no discussion if it's, table salt or if it's something like a mineral salt that has a much better profile of trace elements. They say, manage your stress, which tell someone who's irate to relax, see how well that goes for you. So managing stress is a very general statement without any specific guidelines to the person. And the third thing is get some exercise. And imagine someone who has chronic hypertension, who's never exercised before, and they decide to join a CrossFit gym or something like an Orange Theory, where they're jumping up and down, massive deviations in blood pressure, potentially getting their heart rate up to a speed that it's not been in years. Excessive exercise usually is something that happens right before a heart attack for people who are exercisers but are also massively hypertensive. So considering what the go-to strategies are, they don't seem to be working all that well. And there's a lot of antithrombotic drugs out there, but there are much better ways to help break down natural clots in the system without the negative side effects of low energy as a result of what some of these drugs do to people. And then there's that whole high stress cliche. And we've, talked about this in many of the past lectures, but I think it brings attention or requires attention again, because most people we see are living in the Western world. And if you live in the Western world, there's a lot of stress just by simply, keeping up with what you require to do. So someone who doesn't have true hypertension, as I mentioned before, can demonstrate temporary hypertension. And I can actually attest to, I've experienced this myself, running over to a medical appointment one time, didn't have breakfast, crushed a coffee in the morning, potentially running late. I did my blood pressure and it was like 140 something over 96. And I almost had a small heart attack myself, because I'm like, oh my God, that's hypertensive. And then I asked to run my blood pressure again after I had gone through the appointment, and it came back down to an acceptable range. Because if we're chronically sympathetically dominant, the purpose of the sympathetic nervous system is to manage stress. So if you look at the central nervous system here with the brain and spinal cord, the initial response to stress instantly releases all these catecholamines and your cortisol to increase cardiac output, to retain water, to increase potential blood pressure, and increase vascular resistance. So you're actually driving up blood pressure simply by being stressed, by being alive. So people who are sympathetically wired also have an affinity for having the likelihood of walking around more hypertensive than they may understand that they are. And that's why under any hypertensive intervention, doing something that helps to recruit the vagus nerve to help, shed nervous energy, and teaching someone to breathe properly and come back down to a baseline of, stress isn't their normal, to have the ability to both up and down regulate stress appropriately. This also clears up someone who may be artificially hypertensive, but because of lifestyle will develop true hypertension down the line. And although we're talking more about systemic enzymes today, you might not think to deal with someone's hypertension to see if it's true hypertension or not with bringing them back down to earth using something like sun balance or suntheanine. So anything that can help regulate mineral balance in the body, water balance in the body, anything that can down regulate the adrenal output or somehow increase vagal tone can help deal with circumstantial hypertension. If it's a behavioral thing, that person obviously needs to help themselves rewire their relationship to reality, but using certain supplements to help deal with chronic activation of the nervous system through, down regulating glutamate and upregulating GABA like suntheanine, or if someone does have chronic neuroinflammation, that neuroinflamed person is going to be sympathetically dominant. The sympathetically dominant person is likely going to be potentially hypertensive. So you might be able to move the needle with using these supplements strategically, in addition to some things we're going to talk about very soon. Because the reality is, the heart pumps blood around the body to deliver oxygen and nutrition to cells. And once that blood has done that job, the leftover blood, for lack of a better description, the interface at the matrix of the cells and the circulatory systems remove the waste and metabolic toxins and environmental toxins, so they can be detoxified through the liver and the kidneys, and they can actually get shuttled out either through the venule system or through the lymphatic system. So for me, I always look at the foundation of health very simplistically. What does a cell need? It needs energy via adequate nutrition. It needs hydration. It needs to balance its pH, and it needs to have the in and out system regulated. In needs to go nutrition, out needs to come metabolic waste. And when people think hypertension, they think, oh no, cardiovascular disease, heart attack, end stage stuff, which is absolutely true. But if you have someone who's hypertensive, while they may not be at the point of having a heart attack, their current state is actually decreasing in vitality. Because the harder the body has to work to pump blood around the entire system, the more difficult it is to deliver that blood to the cells that need it. As the cells and the cardiovascular system that integrates with those cells, the pathways become more compromised because the pressure gets downregulated. There's an increased deposition of connective tissue or scar tissue. Sometimes the blood does not flow through those tiny vessels optimally because the capillaries are so small in some cases. They're meant to be potentially 1 or 2 red blood cells thick in diameter, and they're also the most fragile aspects. So if they're going to be the ones that are compromised, blood may be getting pumped to the tissues, but they're not getting delivered to the tissues, and the body systemically suffers because the lack of oxygen and nutrient delivery is, in my opinion, directly correlated to the lack of vitality and ultimately energy that person can display. So while hypertension and cardiovascular disease have kind of been categorized pathologically as the end stage or the beginnings of the end stage of what results in a heart attack, someone who is hypertensive has a harder time healing because the body is more anaerobic. The body's not making energy as effectively. So the overall performance of every cell, every tissue, every organ in the body in a hypertensive person, it's like when your iPhone battery only charges to 75%, even though it says 100. Over time, the performance and the storage capacity of that battery is very much compromised and depleted. A hypertensive person and their body has a similar pattern. So I hope that was pretty self-explanatory, and I hope there was some insights gained from that. Being a digestive wellness company, we have to bring it back to what is actually very pertinent to us, because the digestive system does play a very integrated role in how the cardiovascular system essentially deals with life based upon the health of your gut. What do I mean by that? Well, the heart-gut axis is something that is starting to become talked about in research, because not only do people who have things like type 2 diabetes, congestive heart failure, metabolic syndrome, have a very defined phenotype of what their microbiome performs like, or what the profile of the microbiota looks like, there are pathways and potential processes at play that connect poor gut health to poor cardiovascular health. And it's a little foreshadowing because we're going to be talking about some bifidobacteria specifically next month. So if the colon is the principal house of your microbiota, the quantity of bacteria in the colon is by far the most concentrated in the entire body. If your microbiota is an unfavorable profile, an excessively pathogenic population, which you likely will find if you do any sort of stool testing on a hypertensive or cardiovascular diseased client, using probiotics as part of the treatment, especially probiotics that are colonic specific, like Trubifido are, and also have anti-inflammatory characteristics in the kinds of cytokines and interleukins they produce, although you're not working directly on the cardiovascular system. If you take into consideration the heart-gut axis and you help to repopulate or recolonize the colon and the gut, it likely only has beneficial effects systemically within the cardiovascular system. Because dysbiosis, unfortunately, affects all of these areas, and the relationship is the greater the dysbiosis, likely the increased potential of hypertension, the increased likelihood of the development of atherosclerosis, obesity, things like heart disease. And I've included a couple studies here if you want to look at them. So we have to understand the mechanism of action here is the one thing that was not illustrated in that plaque graphic before is there are elements of either bacterial lipopolysaccharides or bacteria translocating in themselves from the small and large intestine into the circulatory system, affecting the health of the cardiovascular system. Because permeability is really the key. The more permeable your gut is, aka the more leaky your gut is, the more likely things meant for being removed from the body via bowel movements and what have you are going to get into circulation. Because underneath every epithelial cell, you have an artery, you have a vein, you have a lymphatic vessel. So that's not a lot of insulation to protect those critical tissues from things like lipopolysaccharides or whatever bacterial metabolites may be created that can leak across the epithelial lining. So leaky gut, likely leaky heart. I don't know if that's a thing, but I just made it up. So when it comes to dealing with clots, issues within the cardiovascular system, systemic enzymes at this point are becoming well known. But in the Western world, there's still a relatively new intervention that is not really all that well understood. And when you dive into what it is they do, it's quite confusing because you see graphics kind of like this. And I looked at this first and went, oh boy, what am I going to do with this? And I think I can break this down here for everyone. So the key understanding is at the top. Using a systemic enzyme, something like a nattozyme, nattokinase, a lumbrazyme, lumbrakinase, or serazyme, serratiopeptidase, can do a couple things. First and foremost, they can augment the body's natural clot clearing processes. So all of these enzymes you see at the top, streptokinase, staphylokinase, urokinase, they are there to help activate the main protein that helps to dissolve a clot in the body when it's formed. And I want to characterize a clot here for a moment. A clot isn't a necessarily bad thing. Just like a scab is a good thing when you fall and scrape your skin, a scab is there to protect the open wound and to help that tissue underneath the scab heal before it falls off. If there's an injury to the cardiovascular system, you have these things called platelets. And the injury causes a functional, a biochemical change inside the arteries that attracts platelets because they want to patch the hole. They want to try to initiate the first step of healing. It's when that clot cannot be broken down and becomes a perpetual issue that then attracts the development of plaque. That's when a clot's a problem. And we have this main protein, as I said, called plasmin, which is what the body naturally makes to break clots down, but it's not super straightforward because plasmin has to be activated. There are inhibitors of plasmin, and plasmin in and of itself sometimes isn't strong enough to degrade fibrin, because anytime you think clot, fibrin and fibrinogen are the proteins that are potentially active in the clot formation process. So things like nattokinase and lumbrakinase, not only can they naturally enhance the degradation of fibrin and help to break down clots actively, their presence on a regular basis in conjunction with the body's natural processes upregulate the natural effectiveness and efficiency of plasmin. So you have two different ways that you can help dissolve clots and potentially break them down before they can become a circulating systemic problem and cause some sort of blockage. Now, the key with degrading fibrin systemically using systemic enzymes is they require two things. Technically three, but the two things are time and consistency. You know, if someone is hypertensive and has been so for a decade, it's likely to assume that there potentially might be more than one clot in formation that needs to be broken down. So in this scenario, you're likely doing hawthorn, you're likely doing magnesium, you're likely doing vitamin K2. Systemic enzymes can be part of that cocktail, but they likely need multiple months of regular use. So consistently using them daily under the right conditions on an empty stomach. I like to do it before bed because together the systemic enzyme not only has a greater effect functionally on breaking down a clot, it can help create a stimulus plan for the body's own endogenous processes. So the key mechanism and understanding there is systemic enzymes not only directly work, but they also play a supporting role in helping the body to heal itself. We get asked all the time, what's the difference between natto and lumbar kinase? And we recently did an Ask Us Anything, which you can go back and watch because I dedicated a lot of time to fielding this response. Mechanistically, they're very similar. From a research perspective, there's a lot more research on nattokinase than there are lumbar kinase. But if we want to create differentiating factors, lumbar seems to be more akin to helping with certain conditions that I've listed here. And nattokinase seems to be a little bit more specific for things like what hypertension develops to. It also has a little bit more of a blood thinning effect. The end of the day, both of them have an ability to reduce fibrin concentrations, thrombin concentrations, and help to disassociate platelets from each other so the blood becomes less sticky and flows more fluidly. And as I said before, adding things like certain kinds of magnesium, vitamin K2 in conjunction, which helps relax the arteries and pull calcium out of tissues, because calcium deposits are also something highly commonly found in plaque. Using lumbar kinase and nattokinase, technically, it's pick whatever you feel is better. Fundamentally speaking, they have similar actions as I mentioned, and their actions are directly acting on the fibrin content in the clot. So in a blood clot, it's not simply all fibrin, but fibrin protein is a large component of a blood clot because it's what initiates the development of a clot in the healing cycle. So it increases the body's ability to break down the necessary components of a clot, but it also helps to activate all processes to directly work on the breakdown, and it stops the inhibition of what typically inhibits clot breakdown and formation, which is high quantities of inflammation and immune activity. If there is an injury ongoingly, the injury and the immune activity and the cytokine production has the ability to inactivate the body's own plasmin concentrations. So you can think of something like lumbar kinase and nattokinase as a backup plan support so that the injury and the effect of what the injury promotes doesn't downregulate the body's own ability to heal itself. When talking in the context of something like hypertension or the cardiovascular system, if someone is on a blood thinning medication, I have yet to find research that shows lumbar kinase has a negative association with anticoagulants. Doesn't mean it's not out there, but I have yet to find that research. So if you have a client who is on something like warfarin or Coumadin and you want to use a systemic enzyme, this would likely be the better one to choose. That being said, you can see that there's a lot of similarities in this whole chart of activity. Nattokinase seems to have a better blood thinning effect than does lumbar kinase. So if someone's desire is for increased anticoagulation and they want to do it naturally, and nattokinase seems to be better at causing platelets to prevent their aggregation, then nattokinase would be the better choice. I've included some links at the end of this lecture because the amount of information that compares them is way too much to include in a simple presentation. Nattokinase, I believe, is very much cardiovascular specific. Systemic enzymes are very much broad spectrum, where lumbar kinase seems to be also quite beneficial in the breakdown of biofilms, potentially attract to various sites of inflammation. So nattozyme and nattokinase is likely the best choice for a cardiovascular specific thing. So if you wanted to start with one, this would be my choice. Lumbar kinase has a little bit more of a systemic effect, and in some cases it has a more powerful effect. So you might actually want to start with nattokinase, and then you can swap out or progress someone to lumbar kinase, but there's nothing to say that you can't use them at the same time systemically. Cerezyme typically doesn't get thought of in the conversation when it comes to the cardiovascular system, but serapeptidase can do something that the other two cannot. So anytime there's a chronic inflammatory response, you have an upregulation of pro-inflammatory enzymes like COX-1, and you have pro-inflammatory cytokines like TNF-alpha and IL-6, you create this swelling response when there's an injury to tissue. Cerezyme seems to be magnetized to dead necrotic tissue, and the upregulation of inflammation is always the first stage in the healing process. So although it doesn't have the antithrombotic properties directly to break down fibrin like Lumberzyme or Natozyme, pairing this with either one of those can actually help accelerate the healing process, because there is old dead necrotic tissue involved in the formation of plaque or the formation of a fibrous cap. Serapeptidase actually has directly, it can actually directly break down the dead necrotic tissue and helps to dissolve scar tissue that not only leads to potential inflammation if the scar tissue is never properly broken down, scar tissue can't integrate back into the healthy vitality of the network of communication within the body. So its antithrombotic properties, its anti-clotting properties are due to its ability to help break down and eradicate the buildup or built up scar tissue that complements nicely the activation of internal processes that break down clots, a la nattokinase and lumbar kinase, but also their direct activity on breaking down fibrin and minimizing that clot's ability to dislodge and translocate. And then when it comes to lifestyle factors, there are a lot of them, and I'd be remiss not to go over, I think, some of the most important ones, because if anyone's dealing with hypertensive clients on a regular basis, supplements aren't going to do it all. You know, it's a disease of lifestyle. They got there, unfortunately, making some bad choices, but they're going to get out of there, hopefully making some good choices. I mentioned before the global strategy of the recruitment of the vagus nerve. There are multiple ways to do this. The vagus nerve is the brake pedal of the body, whereas the sympathetic nervous system is the gas pedal. If someone's go, 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 they either need to find a way to vent the nervous energy, they need to find a way to bring their system down and focus on breathing and various other aspects that allow the body to recruit the vagus nerve, because the vagus nerve is also the principal stimulus of digestion. And it's fair to say if someone's hypertensive, they're likely sympathetic dominant. If they're sympathetically dominant, they're likely not digesting their food well. If they're not digesting their food well, they're compromising their microbiome. With a compromised microbiome creates the potential for the development of gut permeability. We've told this story multiple times. So supporting digestion and helping them bring back online this nerve that actually stimulates the anabolic healing response in the body, very important. The second thing is looking at exercise. As I said before, I would never send a hypertensive person to a CrossFit gym and have them do, you know, a box jump and all these things that are incredibly stressful on the system. But I would have them do zone 1 and zone 2 cardio multiple times a week, because what that does is it increases systemic circulation in a more gentle and sustained way. And it actually helps to re-regulate blood flow, nutritional delivery to working muscles and also working organs. But regular exercise can help to deal with some of the stiffening of the arteries that come from hypertension that's been chronic. Third thing is, if they're overweight, simply reducing excessive body weight, specifically adipose tissue, can help reduce the stress upon the cardiovascular system. Because when you add excessive fat tissue, you have to vascularize that fat tissue. So what the process of angiogenesis, creating new arteries and circulatory routes, you know, it's like taking a tube and stretching it out further. You're going to narrow it and reduce the potential efficiency of flow. And reducing body weight is one of the best strategies for someone who's dealing with hypertension. Eliminating polyunsaturated fats, specifically omega-6s. These fats, simply being in excess in the body, are pro-inflammatory, and excessively, they are what create the activation of certain pathways that I just talked about, introducing Cerezyme. those lipooxygenase, cyclooxygenase pathways stimulate the release of arachidonic acid, which is an omega-6 derivative. So if someone's eating a lot of sunflower oil, safflower oil, lots of nuts and seeds, things that are omega-6 dominant, the whole idea of high cholesterol, animal fat consumption, leading to the development of plaque in the arteries has been disproven multiple times. Since we have reduced saturated fat consumption and dramatically raised polyunsaturated fat consumption, we've seen that very much correlate with a rise in the incidences of heart disease and cardiovascular risk. Why? Because polyunsaturated fats very easily oxidize in the body. If you oxidize a polyunsaturated fat, you've essentially turned it into a pseudo-trans fat. And if you're eating those on a regular basis and your body's riddled with inflammation, not a good combination. Last time I checked, a match and a drip of gasoline aren't a good thing to do when you're inside a house. The fifth thing rather is regulation of circadian rhythm and sleep hygiene. If you remember at the beginning, that diagram showed a very distinct pattern of blood pressure when you honor the natural circadian rhythm of the body. Blood pressure drops precipitously at night, but if someone is either chronically underslept or they're going to bed too late and they're dysregulating their circadian rhythm, it also increases the output of cortisol, stress hormones, which cause a natural constriction on the arteries. Intake of minerals. Minerals are probably one of the most unsung heroes in the health space because proper mineral balance helps to regulate pH. It helps to regulate the quantity of fluid volume in the arteries, and critically, the ratio of potassium to sodium, which has become dramatically imbalanced with the advent of fast food, preserved foods, things of that nature, always predominate with incredibly high levels of sodium, which influences excessive water accumulation, and low levels of potassium, which helps to counteract the effect of sodium. So not only do we need our trace minerals, not only for our health, but to activate systemic enzymes, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, that's what we use astrazyme for, but using the right kinds of salt, not iodized table salt, which has been heated to 1500 degrees, but something like a Redmond salt or a Celtic gray salt, which not only has the sodium, but it has a profile of all the trace minerals the body needs in conjunction with sodium to regulate water balance. Management of blood sugar, very crucial. When blood sugar goes up excessively, you start to see the degradation and inflammation and the arteries go up, and all you need to do is look at someone's HbA1c to see potential arterial inflammation as a result of carbohydrate abuse. It's not that carbohydrates are bad, but when someone's metabolically compromised and their blood sugar is chronically high, that can compound the negative effects of hypertension. And then there's strategic supplementation, because the goal is to allow the body to repair itself. You as the practitioner are, the Sherlock or Enola Holmes, so to speak, and we have to understand these processes so we can drive the right signals into the body that the body's missing to activate self-healing mechanisms, because arterial plaque can be broken down and a hypertensive person can get back into a healthy range when it comes to blood pressure. They just need to know that it's possible. So here are some further readings that I encourage everyone to dive into. Natozymes on the left, lumbrazymes in the middle, and the two articles on the right, and the two articles in the middle are actually comparing lumbrakinase and nattokinase. And with that, everyone, I want to thank you for being here for the first lecture of 2024. I really enjoyed diving into hypertension because it made me realize just how important this metric is to gather. If you are seeing people on a regular basis, try, standardizing your data collection process when you measure their blood pressure, and doing a regular blood pressure and heart rate variability check together can give you a ton of information that is both useful and very non-invasive for the client. So on that, I will stop the screen share.